In this video, we're going to look at JavaScript object notation. The Node Package Manager, which we're going to look at next, uses JSON or JavaScript object notation files for configuring modules. So it makes sense to look at JSON a bit before we go look at Node Package Manager. JSON is a standard format used to transfer data over networks. It's so much a part of the web that Node has fully embraced it as a data format. JSON's pretty structured, but it's a pretty easy structure, and it has a few restrictions which we're going to look at. So let's look at an example. Here's a JSON file, just text. The first thing you might notice is that all the key value pairs are in quotes. So that's one of those restrictions of a JSON file. All the key value pairs must be in quotes. There's a number of different types of values we can have in a JSON file, and this particular file shows examples of all of them. First, we have strings, as seen in first name and last name. We can also do Boolean, as seen with isAlive. Numbers, we see examples of that in age and height. Address is an array. So the address key has a number of values in that key. Then we see an example of an embedded or another JSON object in phone numbers. And then finally, we see the null value in additional info. The second restriction that we see in JSON files is that the last value does not have a comma. Notice all the other values have a comma, except for the last one in the array of address. So again, the last one doesn't have a comma. So that's the basic structure of a JSON file. In order to work with this JSON data, we're going to need a way to convert it into a JSON string. JavaScript provides a global object called JSON that gives us those functions for converting these JSON objects into a JSON string, which can then be sent over a network, written to a file, or anything else you'd like to do with it. Let's look at an example of the JSON object in action. I'm going to open up a file I've created called convert.js. In the first line, we're defining a variable example and calling the JSON example file with the require function. A note here, in Node, when the require function is used, if it doesn't find a JS file, it looks for a .json file. That's what's happening here. It's looking for, or it's finding rather, the .json file. Next, we're going to convert that example into JSON using, or JSON string rather, using the JSON stringify function. And we're going to load that into a variable called JSON and print it out in the console. Then we're going to use that same stringified JSON file to convert it back to JSON object notation that we saw originally in the JSON example file. Let's run this. To do that, I'm going to go into my terminal. I happen to be using WebStorm, and it has a terminal, and I'm in the JSON folder. So I'll run the convert.js file by running node convert.js, and I get two results back. The first is the string produced by stringify, and the second is the JSON object, like what we saw in the original JSON example file. So we've now seen an example of how we can convert a JSON object notation file into a string and then parse it back again.